grew up in Alaska, and I went to school in Southern Oregon State with my brother Pat. And there's not a lot of time in between Thanksgiving break and Christmas break, so it's not like I had time to go home. And so Pat said, in 1992, he said, "You're coming home with me." And so we took the trek and pulled up at the house and walked in, and Rose was there. She was the first one that I met, and she said, "Oh, welcome to our house. Now wash your hands, Dad is coming home." And I said, "I'm fine." And she said, "I said wash your hands." "Yes, ma'am." So Fred came home about 5 minutes later, and at the time, Pat was going in the kitchen and he made a milkshake out of a half gallon of ice cream, put it in the blender, and Fred came home, he sat down in his chair, he put his hat on the table, and we both watched Pat. Pat took the blender and he took it to his head, and he said, "Oh, brain freeze." I looked at him and shook my head. Then he did it again. "Oh, brain freeze." And Fred said, "Are you stupid?" At that point, I said, "I love this man. He thinks just like I do." Now, I need to convert myself to a half Hispanic female young lady. This is coming from Kat. My dad, whom I will mostly call Fred throughout this, was just rad. Some of you may be wondering why I call him Fred and not Dad. It's simple. Being the baby of the family, I think he and Rose, yes, Rose, not Mom, became numb to the words Mom and Dad around the time I was in junior high school. They just did not and still don't respond to Mom and Dad, but they do respond to Fred and Rose. There are so many great memories and stories about Fred that it is hard to pick what to share. As you may know, Fred was born and raised in Idaho Falls. He was funny and an amazing storyteller. He loved his family and friends. There was nothing he wouldn't do to protect or help them if they were in need. Fred was honest, caring, hardworking, and amazingly talented. Fred and Rose met at a social party at Aunt Nancy's that had at Granny's house. I don't know the complete timeline, the details, but I know he was living in Washington, and at the time, when he asked Rose to marry him, he did so over the phone and in Spanish. One of my favorite stories that Fred told me was when I was in high school. I was supposed to go to Bonneville High School, but I always wanted to go to Idaho Falls High. So I did. After the first few days of school, Fred asked me if there was a step on the back stairwell that was missing, a tile. Yes, there was a missing tile on that step. Fred got that sly, mischievous grin on his face and laughed. He then proudly told me he was responsible for that missing tile. He and a couple of his buddies went bowling down the hall between classes when an actual bowling ball, and as the bowling ball went down the stairs, it broke that tile. I'm fairly certain that tile is still missing today. Fred loved cars and model airplanes. Whenever I smell the fuels used in the model engines, great memories of model planes hanging in Granny's back porch and in the basement come back. Fred worked for hours to get them working, to fly them again. It was a true labor of love for him. Many of you here may have been fortunate enough to be part of the car racing community and family. These memories go on for days. Fred loved his Alfa Romeo. It was a gift from the love of his life, Rose. He loved racing on every 4th of July by the Civic Center, driving the car in the parade, racing at Bonneville High School, and the hills climbs. I think those events were his favorite. The friendships he made truly did last a lifetime, and I cannot express how much that family meant to him. Fred taught me to drive in the Alpha. The first time I drove the Alpha, I was both excited and terrified that he let me drive her. I was mostly terrified because I will never forget the look of horror on his face when I pulled out. I mean, peeled out in the gravel driveway. Gravel sprayed all the way up the back of the Alpha. The good news was it wasn't that bad, and I lived to drive and eventually race another day. Fred and Rose have two of the biggest hearts ever. They have always been amazing to all of our friends and let us kids bring home strays. And by strays, I'm not talking about dogs. I'm talking about all of our friends throughout the years. Many of which you'll know who they are. I became family and never left. Fred and Rose are mom and dad, grandpa, grandma, uncle, auntie, and so much more to those that know them. They are all these names and much more by caring and loving for their family and friends around them. I'd like to leave this with some fun facts about Fred that you may not know. He was a sergeant in the Army Reserves. He was a boxer. He was a golfer. He was a member of the Knights of Columbus. He and Rose lived in Sacramento where Pat and Danny were born. He loved to bowl, especially with his dad. He was an amazing artisan with plaster, wood, and other mediums. He loved writing letters and stories. He was a member of the Guys and Dolls Car Club. He was hit by a car when he was in his 20s, I think 20s, and never knew who did it until about 10 years ago, where he was at a funeral and a gal came to him and confessed that she was the hit and run driver that night, and he was sorry, and she was sorry. Despite what he said, Fred loved every one of his bulldogs, and mine too. Fred loved to ski. He was a really good skier, and he passed on to Danny and I the gift of skiing. He once drove to Denver to buy a pair of ski boots because they were the top of the line and he had to have the best. At that time, they were around $300. He loved everyone here and is thankful for all the memories and friendships he had through the years. Lastly, and most important, number 4 was his favorite. I just know it. Thank you so much.